Is everybody entered, by the way? Who's going
Yes.
to enter?
I
All right, why don't we get underway? And let me welcome you to this session sponsored by Economists for Peace and Security. My name is James Galbraith. I'm a trustee and past chairman of EPS. The session is entitled Reimagining Reparations, the Economics of Reparations in the Context of U.S. Compensation history, I think, but I will defer to, my handwriting has failed me on that point. This is a session which has been assigned a rather peculiar category by the American Economics Association, Z1, Cultural Economics, Economic Sociology, and Economic Anthropology, which I'm inclined to say is just a sign of the true importance and subversive character of what we are engaged on this afternoon. And I want to welcome everybody here to listen to a very distinguished panel present their research into this area. We have four presenters. They are Cornell Brooks and Linda Bilmes, both of Harvard University, William Darity, universally known as Sandy of Duke University, and Neta Crawford of Boston University. And I would like to welcome this panel. Thank you very much for your willingness to participate and to present this afternoon, and to offer the floor to you in the order I just mentioned for 20 minutes apiece. So, Professor Brooks, why don't you take the lead, and the floor is yours. Oh, I should say one other thing, excuse me, which is that the questions should be offered in the Q&A box, the chat being disabled by the powers that be. And we will have time at the end of the four presentations to take those questions and to engage the audience. So again, Professor Brooks, the floor is yours.
Sure. So first of all, let me just begin with a word of appreciation to all the panelists and the moderator, particularly given the vagaries of the pandemic. So we really appreciate your time and expertise. Linda and I will, for a few moments, present on the topic of reparations under this title, that is Callie House, Revisited, U.S. Norms for Compensating Harms and Implications for Reparations for Black Americans. And the reason we begin with Callie House is that in many ways, the reparations story is animated by her biography. That is to say, Callie House was a formerly enslaved Black woman who was born in 1861 in Rutherford County, Tennessee. She was born a few years before the end of slavery, and she spent her infancy as an enslaved child. Subsequent to freedom, that is to say the end of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, she created an organization which was the largest and first grassroots organization for reparations. That is to say, the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief and Benefit and Pension Association, which was comprised of hundreds of thousands of people all across the South, with chapters all across the South, southern states, and former border states. We begin with her story because as a laundry woman, a mother of five, a brilliant organizer, she created this organization that lifted up the cause of reparations, both in terms of legislative advocacy, that is to say, having legislation introduced in Congress, but also litigation. Between legislation and litigation, she sought with hundreds of thousands of others to have African Americans compensated for the harms that they suffered during slavery. The legacy of Callie House, as represented in the calls for reparations, have been met with a number of objections. Those objections have been threefold, namely the length of time elapsed between enslavement and the call for reparations, or the present demand for reparations, the difficulty, administrative difficulty of administering a program, and the sheer cost. This paper and this research responds to those threefold objections in these ways. Number one, we create a taxonomy of harms to African Americans. That is to say, a scheme or categorization of these harms. Two, and somewhat distinctively, a visualization of the interconnection of these intergenerational harms, the ways in which they interact, the ways in which they compound, the ways in which they evolve over time. Thirdly, we conduct an audit of existing reparatory compensatory programs in government. That is to say, the ways in which the U.S. government, the federal government, recognizes harm and compensates individuals and communities that have been harmed. So if we can turn to the next slide. We begin with the obvious, that there's a set of harms that have been inflicted against African Americans as a consequence of federal policy, action, inaction, negligence, and indirect effects. These harms are rooted in chattel slavery, but they're not limited to chattel slavery. These harms have evolved over time. They intersect, they're intertwined, they compound, and that they have intergenerational consequences that may be felt, may be measured in the present day. These harms can be visualized. That is to say, using data visualization, we can note the relationship between certain inflection points in history, certain nodes in history, to see the ways in which these harms in housing, in the realm of criminal justice or voting, interact in ways that are measurable and that may be felt and seen in people's lives. And fifthly, we note the dynamic effect of these lives, of these harms, I should say, visualized as a living tree, if you will. If we can go to the next slide. Okay. One of our students in this reparations project endeavored to help us think about the ways in which the harms that have been visited upon Black Americans have evolved over time, but also have interacted categorically one to another. And she rendered this as a tree with roots, with a trunk, with limbs extending upward, with an axis in terms of time, and an axis that crosses categories of harm. This tree, drawn by our student Hillary Anderson, was inspired by the jazz songstress, singer, I should say, Billie Holiday, and the writer, a Jewish school teacher by the name of Abe Mirapol. That is to say, strange fruit, blood at the leaves and blood at the root. So this two-dimensional picture inspired the data visualization that you will see next. If we can go to the next slide. Now, I should note at the very outset that this data visualization that we rendered on QMU, that we are migrating that and a large amount of data to a new platform, but we just wanted to give you a sense of this. The categories of harm are housing, labor, criminal punishment, healthcare, education, violence, and disenfranchisement. And what you see before you are significant events in terms of America's racial history. There are significant inflection points in terms of harm. So if I can ask my colleague Yaya if we could just start that just for a few, about a minute or so that you might have a sense of how this would work. So you'll note that you have various harms like the black codes, the slave codes, residential segregation, voting. And we have taken note of specific laws, policies, historical events and tried to relate them one to another so as to help us assess more completely the ways in which these harms have impacted people's lives. That is to say, these harms are not freestanding, but they in fact are compounding. Which is to say, the GI Bill certainly affected discriminatory application of the GI Bill certainly affected World War II vets and Korean vets, but it also affected their descendants. So if we can quickly go to the next slide. Okay. When we speak of the interrelated and intergenerational harms that we would attempt to address with reparations, a powerful example of the ways in which these harms interact, of course, World War II and Korean War veterans. So you'll note that the GI Bill signed in 1944 provided college tuition, low-cost loans, unemployment insurance to veterans. There were 1.2 million Black veterans who served in World War II, 8% of the total, 500,000 in the Korean War. But few Black veterans actually received these benefits. That is to say, African American veterans received a paltry, infinitesimally small fraction of the educational and housing benefits that were available. This had a number of effects. It's not merely the limited number of Black vets who receive benefits, say, for example, in terms of education. It was also the range of benefits they were able to access. That is to say, being limited to HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, those colleges and universities having limited bandwidth, limited enrollment, but also limited programming. That is to say, not having schools of engineering, not having schools of dentistry or medicine in the main, which had a number of consequences in terms of the sheer number of Black professionals, Black wealth, Black intergenerational wealth, contributing to the wealth gap, which Professor Darity has written so powerfully about. We note that the home ownership gap is large. Non-Hispanic whites, 74%, Blacks, 44%. The point being is the combination of these harms, housing and education, don't stand alone, but they in fact compound in ways that are incredibly destructive and harmful. Next slide. Okay. Now this paper makes the case that there are norms existent in the federal government in terms of the way the federal government operates what we call reparatory compensatory or reparatory compensation programs. That is to say, programs that we take note of every day that really operate on the norm that the government recognizes the harm and endeavors to make, if not make a person or a community whole, to make them better. This operational norm, if you will, is grounded in ethical, moral norms that we see in Judaism, in Christianity, in Islam, in Hinduism, in the philosophy of John Locke. This notion that when a harm occurs, there is an obligation, a responsibility to not merely recognize the harm or seek forgiveness for the harm, but to make a person or a community or a harmed individual, if not whole, better. There are a number of historical examples of reparatory compensation or reparations, formally speaking. We have the slaveholders in D.C. who received reparations for the loss of their property, their human property, that is to say, enslaved human beings. Japanese Americans who receive reparations which are a small fraction relative to the harm that they endured, but these reparations were extended in two packages, if you will. African Americans, when we think about the Special Order, Field Order 15, that is to say 40 acres and a mule, some modest recognition of Blacks being denied both body, property, lives, and harms in a variety of ways. Reparations in the United Nations context is a normative example. It provides formal categories of reparations, that is to say restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, the guarantees of non-repetition. The point being here is there is in government, in terms of a wide variety of programs, operational examples of reparatory compensation. There are examples in terms of our religious and moral philosophical traditions, and they are in fact historical examples. Next slide. So now, with that being said, I will turn the podium, if you will, over to my colleague, Linda Bilmes, to make this point clear in terms of the wide range of programs that we have today.
Okay,
So-
well, let me introduce Linda Bilmes, who is a co-chair, I believe right now, of the Economists for Peace and Security, and my friend and colleague for many years. Linda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you to Economists for Peace and Security for sponsoring this panel. I want just to say that my background was not in this field. My background is studying public finance and studying how society allocates resources. And I took a look at this issue for the first time in the summer of 2020, when two of my students, who were respectively the president of the Harvard Kennedy School Black Students Association and the Harvard Law School Black Students Association, came to me and asked me if I would take a different kind of look at this issue and see if we could think about how we could pay for reparations. And when I started looking at the US government and how we pay for other kinds of reparatory compensation, I realized that the solution was kind of hiding in plain sight, because in fact, the US government has hundreds, if not thousands, of programs that provide reparatory compensation for a very wide range of harms, for economic harms, for property losses, for environmental exposures, for disasters, for physical harms, for government policy, intentional and accidental harms. And we pay for them in a variety of ways. Some are paid for through taxpayer dollars, but a lot are paid for through excise taxes, through fines, through trust funds, and other mechanisms. And if I could have the next slide, please. When you start on this and you start to think about how we pay reparatory compensation for harms, it is very similar to looking at the sky at night when first you see a few stars, and then you start looking and you see an increasing number of stars, and pretty soon you see the whole galaxy. We have programs in this country for sardine fishermen. We have programs for Christmas tree growers. We have programs for protecting people, some of which are large and well known, like protecting pensions for 33 million Americans paid for through insurance premia. And we have programs that are very little known. And these are just looking really at federal programs. So I was just going to introduce, just to give you a sense of the kind of range, just a few examples to open our eyes to how we actually do this for all other kinds of harms. So I could have the next slide, please. Just to start with one that is kind of close to home. We have a national vaccine injury compensation program established in 1988, which provides compensation for any injuries that are presumed to be caused by CDC recommended vaccines. Now, presumed is a very important word, because as in the veterans programming, where I have done a lot of work in the past, there is this concept of presumption. So you do not have to absolutely prove that you were injured by a vaccine, but you just have to show that you had a particular injury which is likely to have been associated by a vaccine within a certain number of months of receiving the vaccine. Now, this program, which has been around for a long time, has had about 25,000 petitions filed, of which 42% were approved. The payouts are around $5 billion, and it is funded by a 75-cent tax on every dose of vaccine, which means that, for example, the MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, the vaccine manufacturers pay $2.25 because it's 3 doses. And that is basically a very typical way that these are set up, which is that the manufacturers, vaccine manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, are indemnified in exchange for paying this excise tax, which in turn pays for a large number of claims to be paid for those who are injured for and can provide for lost earnings, survivor death benefits, pain and suffering, and so forth. Now, interestingly, when I started to look through these 25,000 petitions, I discovered that I was surprised to see that there were not a lot of COVID-19 vaccine claims. And that is because there is yet another program, the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, that was set up after the 2009 H1N1 flu vaccine, for which is actually where the COVID-19 vaccine claims are going. And this is a broader program where injuries due to vaccine, medication, devices, quote, or other items used to, quote, prevent, diagnose, or treat public health emergencies can be claimed. And again, it covers unreimbursed medical expenses, lost earnings, survivor death benefits, and so forth. And this program has to date received over 5,000 claims for injuries related to COVID-19 vaccines. But I would suspect that the only reason it has actually received that number instead of many more is because many of these programs are not very well known. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of these programs, but if you don't happen to be looking very carefully, it would be quite possible to miss the program. Let me turn to the next slide to look at a different kind of program. Another example, and I want to emphasize these are illustrative, these are simply examples. Another example of a way in which we provide reparatory compensation and benefits are for workers who are affected by trade, adverse trade or market conditions. And there are programs in the Department of Labor, in the Defense Department, at USDA, that's the Appalachian Regional Commission, as well as in the Treasury and a number of other agencies. Now, these programs are set up in a way that each program, there are at least 15 programs that are very active that I identified. And for example, in the Department of Labor programs, for anyone who can argue that they are presumed to have lost their job as a result of increased imports or shift of production overseas, can qualify for stipends and retraining. So for example, and you only need, in order to qualify, 2 workers to file a petition, which doesn't, of course, guarantee that it will be approved. But 2 workers can say, such and such company that we're working for decided to outsource such and such item that we were manufacturing to India. And I've looked through thousands of these actual claims, and this is the kind of thing that people argue in their claim forms. And that has a reasonable likelihood of being approved. People can, depending on where they are located and what they are making, they can qualify for a range of benefits. There are a lot of success stories that are on the website, which usually show somebody who has been retrained and is now involved in manufacturing something else. Within the Department of Defense, there is a lot of effort to provide this kind of benefit when weapon systems are canceled in particular locations. These can be directly to individuals, they can be to communities, they can be to companies, they can involve stipends, retraining, relocation, and so forth. And I would just say that when Cornell and I presented this to Ash Carter a couple of weeks ago at the Belfer Center at Harvard, as we were talking about this, he said, you know, as you're mentioning this, Linda, I'm thinking about the Defense Department. This is Ash Carter, the former Secretary of Defense, and I realized, yeah, we do this every day. We have lots of programs that do this, that pay these sort of benefits. If I can have the next slide, please. Now, let me provide a third example, which is a slightly different way of thinking about this, which is in the previous two examples and in many of our programs, we're providing specific compensatory reparations, reparatory compensation, financial restitution to people after the fact. So people who have been exposed to pesticides, people who have been exposed to nuclear waste, people who have been exposed to all different kinds of things for which there are programs. But we also do provide an enormous amount of insurance to insure people against harms which they are likely to face. So for example, the National Flood Insurance Program subsidizes 5 million policyholders. We spend $3 billion a year in subsidizing this. And the way that the flood insurance program works, as some of you may know, is that you are compensated to, in fact, rebuild your house in exactly the same place where it already is. So that even if you are in a flood zone, I mean, this is a program that makes no sense because if you're in a flood zone already and you have to buy flood insurance or you're subsidized, and given climate change, the likelihood is that you are going to be rebuilding it in a zone that has a higher likelihood of flooding in the future, which means that the amount that the government pays for the subsidy is higher. Looking at the crop insurance program, which is one of the largest insurance programs in the United States, the US pays for more than 100 crops, including corn, wheat, soybeans, etc., a significant amount of money per year in both catastrophic insurance and in regular insurance. And the list of things for which you can be insured against occupies several pages of different types of weather problems, as well as different types of crop diseases, different types of worms and insects and predators and contaminations and market forces and so on and so forth. It's a very significant program in which we buy up at regular prices the crops for those who are farmers for all of these mainstream crops. Now, again, when you keep looking for programs, you find more and more, because as it turns out, if you are not producing a crop that is eligible for the federal crop insurance program, you can qualify for the federal non-insured crop insurance program, which is a slightly less generous program, but this includes Christmas trees and ginseng and ornamental nurseries and turf grass sod and whatnot. And so if you are producing Christmas trees and you have any of the above listed categories of predators or crop diseases or weather related disasters or other kinds of harms that can befall those trees, the federal government will buy up to 2/3 of the expected yield at 100% of the market price for if the farmer pays a $325 fee. Now, there are hundreds of these kind of insurance programs. Perhaps the best known is the, obviously, I'm not arguing here that these programs are not good programs or that we shouldn't have them. What I'm arguing is that we have them and we should look at how they are structured. We have the FDIC program for insuring depositors at banks. This is a large scale program. It's funded by premiums from that banks and savings associations pay, like the insurance premium that is paid by which funds the Federal Pension Guarantee Corporation. You have a large scale national effort to ensure that any kind of harms are mitigated to some extent. We don't reimburse all people's pensions. We don't reimburse all people's bank deposits, but there is a massive scale, long established, huge program from an administrative perspective that does this kind of work. If I could have the next slide, please. I wanted to just mention one program that is more of the type of program that is typically discussed when we talk about reparations. It is, I would argue, it is incorrect to only look at, to define reparations as a program that by looking at Japanese reparations and the American Indian Trust Fund and the other small number of reparations of this category, but just to look at one, to look at how it's organized. The American Indian Trust Fund is a program in which the American Indian nations had signed treaties with the United States ceding land but retaining the resource rights, and the federal government was supposed to be the bank for all of the proceeds for the activities on the land, which were things like timber and drilling and mining. But it stole and mismanaged the proceeds for many years. Some of the American Indian nations had appealed to the government for $48 billion, which was the amount that they believed these activities had generated. And in 2010, President Obama signed for a small portion of that, a $3.4 billion settlement for descendants of the original rights. And the Department of Interior now oversees these acres in fiduciary trust for the nations, and in some cases for individuals, manages the funds and distributes $1 billion annually to individuals, which by 2030 will be 11 million people who will be eligible. And I put this program in here, even though it is a very, it is not to show a comprehensive solution, but to show that here is an existing federal government program that is dealing with 11 million people. It is administratively complex, and it is in operation right now. So I am going to hand it back to my colleague, Cornell now. Thank you.
Thank you. If we can just go to the next slide. We have before us a picture of Sergeant Isaac Woodard Jr. And we have that picture before you because it illustrates a bill proposed by Congressman James Clyburn, Seth Moulton, and Senator Raphael Warnock. As we lifted up previously, World War II veterans suffered from a number of interlocking, compounding harms in terms of education, the denial of education and tuition benefits. Sergeant Woodard, on the day that he left the Army on February 12, Black History Month, 1946, while traveling through South Carolina, he was accosted by local law enforcement who blinded him. And as a consequence of the outcry all across the country, it led to President Truman issuing an executive order integrating the armed services. He did not receive these the benefits that we spoke of. Sergeant Joseph Maddox, a World War II veteran who applied and was accepted to graduate school at Harvard, but was denied his VA benefits because it might set a precedent. These veterans are the namesakes, or I should say, they are the names on this legislation. And the reason we lift up this legislation is because it speaks to the fact that we have a discrete group of claimants, potential beneficiaries of reparations. It speaks to the fact that reparatory compensation is in fact possible, and administratively so, and certainly as a matter of cost, and that there appears to be at least some public policy appetite for reparatory compensation, particularly for veterans, but not limited to veterans. Next slide. And so in conclusion, we just want to lift up the fact that there's a longstanding precedent for reparatory compensation as a normative tool for addressing harms, as we've seen over and over again in the sheer number, the wide variety of federal programs. Second, there's a longstanding norm for the government taking responsibility, but not necessarily a blame, if you will, in terms of compensating Americans for harms. The funding mechanisms are diverse. Let us recall that Callie House, when she filed a federal class action lawsuit, they sought to capture the tax imposed on cotton between 1862 and 1868 to the tune of $68 million. As Linda has demonstrated over and over again, we have precedent, operational precedent for a wide variety of funding mechanisms for reparatory compensation. The federal government has long demonstrated the capacity to administer reparatory programs with large budgets in the millions, in the billions, and even trillions of dollars. America's reparatory norms, precedent, and programs demonstrate the fiscal, administrative, and moral imagination for a program of reparations. Lastly, as we noted before, Black World War II veterans and Korean veterans are an illustrative case, not a limiting case, an illustrative case before us, where we have literally living victims who merit reparatory compensation, and they illustrate the degree to which we can address the problem comprehensively, broadly. And lastly, we end with a question, which is to say, if there is a norm for reparatory compensation for a wide variety of harms, why is there not reparations for racial harms endured by Black Americans? With that said, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you both, Professor Brooks and Professor Bilmes, for a very crisp, informative, and timely presentation. And so I would like to turn the floor over now to Professor William Darity at Duke University, one of my oldest friends, known since we roomed together briefly on arrival in England as Marshall Scholars in 1974, and the author most recently, along with Kirsten Mullen, of the book From Here to Equality. Professor Darity, the floor is yours.
Let me start by saying that the question of financing reparations is a really low priority on my list of concerns or logistical concerns that need to be addressed, particularly in the aftermath of the substantial funding that the federal government has brought forward for the purposes of addressing the Great Recession and the crisis associated with the pandemic. It's very clear that the federal government has the capacity to spend huge sums of money. And the critical issue always has to be whether or not these large bodies of expenditure will trigger significant inflation. So that as long as you design new expenditure programs in such a way that you mitigate the inflation risk, it's really a false question to ask, how are we going to be paying for it? So I'm going to start by saying I'm working on the assumption that this can be paid for, and it's not a high priority concern. What I would like to do is focus on 4 central components that I think a reparations plan ought to feature, and to explain why I think those features are so significant, and in the process talk about the obstacles that are created for a comprehensive reparations program by organizations and individuals that ostensibly are advocates of reparations. Clearly, we have folks who are outright opponents of reparations. There is 30% of the American population that will never support any significant initiative that's supposed to benefit Black Americans. However, there are also individuals who are creating barriers to a comprehensive reparations program who seem to be on the right side of history. And I'm going to argue that, in fact, they're not. So let me start first with saying that a central feature of a reparations plan must be establishing who is eligible to receive the benefits of the program. And from here to equality, Kirsten Mullen and I argue that there are two conditions that need to be met to establish eligibility. The first is what we refer to as a lineage standard. So an individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. The second is what we refer to as an identity standard. So an individual would have to show on a legal document that they self-identified as Black, Negro, African-American, or Afro-American for at least 12 years before the adoption of a reparations plan or a study commission for reparations. Essentially, what we are arguing is there are about 40 million Americans who would be eligible for reparations. These are individuals who are self-identified as Black, and these are individuals who have at least one ancestor who was subjected to enslavement in the United States. This is the population that merits reparations. And we would argue in conjunction that this is the population that is descended from the individuals who were promised the 40-acre land grants in the aftermath of the Civil War, a promise that was not fulfilled, creating a long-standing debt that has yet to be met. In fact, our argument is that reparations is a justice claim, a claim for a debt that has not yet been paid. It is not an anti-poverty program. And so the second feature that's critical in terms of describing a reparations plan is to establish how much would it cost, how much needs to be paid. And so one approach to doing this is to itemize the series of atrocities that have been inflicted on Black Americans. You know, to go one by one down the list, assign a dollar value to each of them, and then add it up. We think that this is an impossible task, and it will not capture the full array of harms because it's simply from an informational standpoint, we simply don't have the ability to do that. There's too much missing information about the way in which Black Americans have been damaged by white supremacy. And so what Kirsten and I propose to do, and from here to equality, is to identify a summary statistic that would capture the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy. And that summary statistic is the racial wealth differential, or the racial wealth gap. And as a consequence, we come up with an argument that says that what a reparations plan must do at minimum is eliminate the racial wealth gap. We argue further that it must eliminate the racial wealth gap measured at the mean rather than the median. Folks customarily say that if you're thinking about differences in outcomes between social groups, you should look at the median conditions that confront each of those groups, because that's more representative of the typical experience of individuals in that group. But we argue that in the context of thinking about racial wealth differences, you should focus on the mean. You should focus on the mean for three fundamental reasons. The first is 97% of the wealth that is held by white Americans in the United States is held by households that have a net worth above the white median, 97%. This means that if you were to focus exclusively on the median, you would be ignoring a vast amount of wealth that is being held by white Americans in terms of establishing your compensatory measures. Secondly, This immense differential that's associated with the households above the median is not attributable exclusively to the top 10% of the distribution or the top 1% for that matter. In fact, there are substantial differences in wealth all along the income distribution. But what's particularly notable is that 1/4 of white households in the United States have a net worth in excess of $1 million. And this is true for only 4% of Black American households. A third point that's salient here is the fact that the professional managerial class in the Black community has 2 to 3 times less median wealth than the working class in the white community. So class parity in terms of occupational status is not accompanied by economic parity, particularly with respect to wealth or net worth. And so as a consequence, we argue, if you're going to close the racial wealth gap, you need to do it at the mean. That's the way in which you erase the entire racial wealth gap. And we argue in turn that the minimal expense for doing that at the present moment would be about $14 trillion. There is then a third dimension that has to be addressed, which is the question of the form of payments. And we argue ultimately that the form in which the reparations fund should be dispersed is as direct payments to the eligible recipients. Now, these direct payments don't necessarily have to take the form of a cash transfer. They could take the form of a less liquid asset. It could be the case that at least some part of the direct payment takes the form of a trust account or an annuity. But the premise is ultimately that the individual recipients should have full discretion over the use of the funds. And it should not be a situation in which funds are channeled through a third party or an intermediary. So, for example, the organizations, the National Coalition on Reparations on Black Reparations in America, in COBRA, and the National African American Reparations Commission, both are advocates of some sort of intermediary process for managing the funds. In fact, NARC actually has a proposal for the formation of something that they call a National Reparations Trust Authority that would manage the funds. And in the process of supporting efforts at piecemeal, what Kirsten and I view as piecemeal reparations or local reparations initiatives, they argued that this would establish local commissions that could manage the funds. We argue instead the money should go directly to the individuals who are eligible to receive them. And then the last critical point as a dimension of a reparations plan is the question of who would pay for it. And we say unequivocally it has to be the federal government. And this is for two reasons. First, the federal government is the capable party. And secondly, the federal government is the culpable party. The federal government is the capable party in the sense that it is the only level of government that has the capacity to meet a bill of the magnitude of $14 trillion. If we set as our goal elimination of the racial wealth gap, and we ask the states and localities to do it, their total budgets come to about $3.5 trillion. So it's virtually impossible for them to meet a bill of that magnitude. In addition, they are tax constrained in a way in which the federal government is not. And so as a consequence, it's the federal government that has to take on the obligation of meeting the reparations bill. But we'd also argue that the federal government is the culpable party because it is ultimately federal policies that have produced the racial wealth gap. Whether you start with the government's failure to fulfill its promise of the provision of 40-acre land grants to the formerly enslaved, while at the same time it was providing 160-acre land grants to 1.5 million white families in the Western Territories to complete its colonial settler project under the terms of the Homestead Act, whether it's the fact that there were 100 massacres that took place between the end of the Civil War and World War II, where hundreds of Black Americans were essentially executed by mob violence, but also their property was typically appropriated or stolen, an act of theft. And in fact, the theologians Quan and Thompson talk about white supremacy as fundamentally an act of theft, a theft of truth, a theft of power, and a theft of wealth. And our focus is on the monetary dimension of the theft of wealth as what's something that is the appropriate target for reparations. And then, of course, subsequent to the Jim Crow period and these massacres, we also had a set of policies that Cornell has been talking about. And those set of policies in the 20th century were focused on asset building via home ownership rather than land acquisition. And these policies were discriminatorily applied in such a way that they helped build white wealth while depriving Black Americans of the opportunity to accumulate wealth in the same ways. And then a final set of federal policies, and that I'm going to mention, this is not the last one, but the final set that I'm going to mention is the set of practices that were associated with the establishment of the nation's highway system, where highways were frequently run through the heart of Black business districts and Black communities, again, destroying Black wealth accumulation in the process of conducting a federal initiative. So let me say this about the question of folks who are ostensibly advocates of reparations who are creating obstacles. The first set of obstacles is associated with the attempt to have local reparations initiatives. I've already pointed out that it's impossible for states and localities to meet the bill that would close the racial wealth gap. But I also think that we have to be very, very careful about what we are calling reparations and whether or not the types of steps that states and localities can take really do constitute the act of compensatory justice that is truly required. Kirsten Mullen and I argue that these types of initiatives, however meritorious, should not be viewed as acts of reparations. And then in addition, there is the whole set of issues that surround the push for HR 40 as legislation that is supposed to create a commission to provide proposals to Congress for reparations. And in several papers, we have talked about the weaknesses of HR 40. One set of weaknesses is associated with the principles that are embodied in the legislation. Another set of weaknesses are associated with the structural characteristics of the law. I'll be glad to talk about this further in the conversation period that takes place here. But the final point I want to make is comprehensive reparations requires a program that would provide compensation to Black American descendants of US slavery. It would provide compensation in a sufficient amount to eliminate the racial wealth gap. It would be provided in the form of direct payments to the eligible recipients. And it would be a project that was conducted by the US government.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And our final presenter this afternoon is Professor Neta Crawford of Boston University. Professor Crawford, the floor is yours.
Well, what an opportunity to engage with such interesting ideas. And I haven't thought about this deeply, probably for about 12 years. So it's taken me back. First, I want to say that I think the paper that I got and the presentation today convinced me that compensation has a long history in the US. It also convinced me that there are mechanisms. I want to add just a few other examples. You probably already know these things, but I'll just raise a few other examples that might be instructive, and I'll tell you why. One, In 1783, Belinda Royal, who changed her name to Sutton, actually petitioned to the Massachusetts legislature for a annual pension. She actually lived about a mile and a half from my house here in Medford, Massachusetts. And she was the slave of Isaac Royal Jr. Belinda's petition is beautiful in that the way it's written, it explains why she wants compensation. But she was granted this annual pension, and the Massachusetts legislature only paid it once. She was granted 3 years, and they only paid it once. That's one example, but I think it just adds to the richness of this tradition. The second example I'll suggest is the War of 1812, when the US government compensated property owners who had damage in the war. Though the Southerners wanted slaves included. Now remember, the British attacked American cities after we destroyed Canadian cities. And the slave owners in the South wanted slaves included, but they were not, and it was just property that was compensated. Third example is, of course, during the Civil War, when compensation was given to some Southerners for foraging and for basically what was theft and destruction. They had to be loyal to the Union, though, to get compensation through the Southern Claims Commission, which began work in 1871. And they had to prove that they were loyal, and there was compensation given to, I believe, several thousand people. Another example, of course, is, and not from the US, is the 1837 Slave Compensation Act, where the British borrowed $20 million, million pounds, to pay for slave owners, and it went to 47,000 families in the Caribbean. Another example, of course, is from more recent times, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's payments to South Africans, 21,000 South Africans who were victims of abuse. Of course, all South Africans were victims of apartheid, so it wasn't everyone. It's just the victims of abuse that went through the TRC process. Fourth example is the Solatia payments made by the United States government to victims either of loss of property or loss of life or harm in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that, we don't have a lot of transparency on that process. I don't exactly know how it functioned, but there's another thing which occurred alongside it, which is in Afghanistan, there was something known as the Commander's Emergency Response Program, where $3.7 billion was paid to, it cost $3.7 billion to administer a program to compensate people to sort of make up for the mess that the US occupation entailed. And then there's the post 9/11 trust fund. But so those are the historical examples. I'm basically bolstering you with some things that I think are interesting and different. I also want to talk about the Native American land back movement. Now, the land back movement is basically right now, I think in part simply a slogan to point out the land theft that was entailed, but it's serious in that they want people to give land back to Native people. Okay, and I think this is a pressing issue in cases and places where there's ongoing violation of water, especially water rights, and there's destruction, ongoing destruction of the land. And that this is part of why this particular movement is gaining traction among Native people. Now, what I want to say besides that is I want to move to a second point and to talk about what I see as what you're doing. you have a question at the end, and you, Cornell, you closed with this question. If reparatory compensation is a federal government norm for responding to harms, why not compensate African Americans for racial harms with reparations? And I want to say that I think you answer what you get to this question, but in a sense, you answer it with a practical response. You show that it's possible and practical to make reparation or compensation, reparatory compensation. But the question of why it's not considered practical and possible, and not why it's not on the table, it seems to me to go to two other factors. One is clearly historical understanding of the harms that you demonstrate is lacking, right? So historical understanding of the interrelated intergenerational harms. And I think this goes to a deeper problem in the American education system, which you of course cannot address, but I think this is something that needs to be repaired, actually, because it is a continuing harm for especially young African American people to have an education system that does not recognize what where we are and how we got there. And then secondly, I think that this lack of historical understanding is still an obstacle for the majority of people who could make the policies from understanding the reason and the necessity for them. The second point is emotional. I think there are two aspects to the emotional problem. You guys you've sort of taken the emotion out of it almost, and I understand why you've done that, because it's like the emotions associated with the whole conversation of slavery and reparation are so volatile that to touch them, you'd need a very long barge pole, and you don't know what you're going to get. So I remember, I'm raising this because I remember when I was on the Slavery and Justice Committee at Brown University, and we had conversations about the history of Brown University, and in particular, named families, but and neighborhoods and practices. The response was visceral, and it was in some ways impossible to have a reasoned conversation. And so I believe that in addition to the historical understanding being lacking, there was an emotional gap that needs to be bridged, or an emotional conversation that has to occur. Now, being a political scientist, I can't tell you the content of that. I think we need therapists to tell us the content of that. But it is, but this goes to a deeper thing, which I think I do understand a little bit, which is the way that slavery and defensiveness about the white role in slavery and the institutions that have benefited from slavery is written on the bodies of American culture and Americans, and that this sort of embodied problem, the emotional resonance here, is an obstacle. So when you ask why not compensate, I say that's the thing, that's the obstacle here. You've shown us that compensation is possible. It happens everywhere. In fact, everywhere all the time. And it should be that we can conceive of this. And then I think we have to go to the next step that you get us to, which is, why don't we conceive of it? And we don't conceive of it because we're not emotionally and intellectually prepared. So I see your work as another step in this long conversation where I think we have to go, just to riff for a moment on your work, back and forth between the passions that are elicited and, once people are sort of engaged, answering their practical questions. So that is a short response to a paper I only got yesterday and only read today. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank again everybody for very crisp and focused presentations. I think I would like to ask those who are here, who are in the audience and we can't see, to enter questions in the Q&A. I see one is there already, but before we go there, I would like to ask the members of the panel, the other members of the panel, if they would like to add anything in response to Professor Crawford or anything in response to each other that they would feel to be appropriate for a few minutes. Anyone else there? Go ahead, Cornell.
Well, let me just start with perhaps the genesis story, if you will, of this research in this paper. Namely, we had a discussion. I had a discussion with Randy Kennedy at the JFK Forum, and we talked about the fact that the complexity of the math often preempts a discussion of the morality. So as Neta has lifted up, there are these stories written on the bodies of Black people, but because of the ostensible complexity of the math, like how would we calculate and Sandy talked about this, how would we come up with a number? How do we tabulate these harms in sequence? How do we calculate the ways in which they interact? That's a very difficult economic and mathematical endeavor. But sometimes the complexity of that, from the vantage point of the public, means we can't have a conversation about the why. So Neta essentially says that we're answering a why question with a how answer. And we're really endeavoring to answer a how question, I should say a why question with a how answer in order to suggest that you really can address the why. Is that responsive?
I think that it is, I understand what you're up to, and I agree with that as an approach. And I think that Sandy's also up to the same thing, right? That's what you guys are doing. You're showing this is possible, but I think that it's that they have to happen at the same time. It has to be an interaction. And when Sandy talks about, his word was, maybe I've lost it in my notes here, but he had a word that I think was just right on there, which is, it's a justice claim, right? The justice claims are emotional claims. And we know from research in justice and norms that people respond to justice claims on an emotional level. They get that somebody was hurt. They feel it. It resonates with them. And so I think but both of you are, both sets of ideas are responsive at this practical register level. And
So I,
yeah.
I thought it was interesting that you said we'd taken emotion out of it, because most people tell me that I am fully emotional when I'm engaged with this issue. That I personally am very, very emotional about this issue. And I think it's true. It's a passion. I've been committed to this for a long period of my life. But the question is whether or not one can pique the emotions of individuals who are either indifferent to this cause or opposed to it. And I would argue that there's about 30% of the US population that will never be supportive of anything along the lines of a reparations plan. This is the 30% of the population that is absolutely convinced that the election was stolen and that was engaged in some significant way with the process of invading the Capitol on January 6th. So those folks' minds are not going to get changed. So the question is, with remaining 70% of the population, can we move forward in terms of building support for reparations? And in fact, we've had some modest success over the past 20 years, because if you go back to the year 2000, when Ravana Popoff and Michael Dawson did a survey of American attitudes towards reparations, only 4% of white Americans endorsed the idea of monetary payments to Black Americans as an act of compensatory justice. By the year 2018, it was about 16%. And today it's closer to 30% of white Americans who will say that they favor monetary payments to Black Americans as an act of reparations. So I think the real question is, what can we learn from not only the psychologists, but also the political scientists? I mean, this should be your domain, about how we can push the needle further in terms of building additional support for this. And if it requires reaching out to people on the emotional plane, that's fine. We spent a lot of time addressing the logistical questions in our book because, those were the questions that people just repeat reflexively all the time. I don't think there's any problem in terms of determining who's eligible, but people will always say, well, you can't determine who's eligible. I don't think there's any problem in terms of trying to come up with a sound estimate of the cost of the program, but people will always say, well, you can't put a dollar figure on that. Well, yes, you can. And so I think your conclusion that there's a both and obligation to try to pursue this struggle is correct. But there were some very serious reasons why we invested a lot of time in talking about the logistical questions.
Can I jump in here for a second?
Go
ahead. So Sandy, when we were starting on this project, we read your book with Kirsten, in detail, every single word, and kind of went through it very, very, very carefully. And then we read a whole series of articles and testimonies and stuff by people who were particularly opposed to reparations. And I don't mean the 30%, I mean the Stu Eisenstats and these kind of people who have repeatedly questioned whether the government could pay for it, whether it could figure out eligibility, whether it could administer a program on this kind of scale, and so forth. And the purpose of our work was not to try and take the emotion out of it, but was to, in some way, amplify what you were doing, and that you were saying, yeah, we can, and here's a way, here's a way to determine eligibility, here's a way to determine how much it would cost. And what we were trying to say is, in fact, we do this every single day. We figure out eligibility, we figure out how much, we administer programs, we come up with the money. We do this every day. I mean, of course, we have just done it on a massive scale for COVID to the tune of $6 trillion. I mean, we've done it. We've provided compensation to people for the harm inflicted by COVID. But we do this so much that this is a great deal of what the federal government does. So when you look at the Department of Labor budget, most of it is paying compensation to people for various kinds of harms. And so we were trying to say, this whole issue of paying reparations for this huge harm, which could not possibly be better documented, we're trying to ask a much more rhetorical question, which is, how is it possible that even in the face of this incredible obviously moral harm, and in the face of the fact that we determine eligibility and come up with money and so forth every single day for everything else, how is it that this is the one area that we are not doing this for.
It's because of old-fashioned American racism.
I mean, yes, it is, but it's also, I mean, you were talking about people who are, as it were, well-meaning, hiding behind, this, we need to have a commission, we needed to do it in the local level, it's other topics. I mean, the place where at the federal level these things hide, as you know better than I, and certainly when I was the number 3 as assistant secretary and CFO of the Commerce Department for several years, the place where people hide the opposition is around, oh, well, we can't administer it, we don't have a program, it's not authorized, that's where it gets hidden, that's where the opposition is. And I feel that a lot of the locus of opposition now is in this area. People saying it's too complicated, we can't administer, can't find the money, etc. And we're trying to say that's not the case. We have got literally hundreds of examples. And as Neta just said, if we even just put a spotlight on another part of the sky, we can come up with some more. We do this all the time. This is not a radical idea. It is a entirely normative approach that we use on every single other problem we can think of.
Okay. I have a few observations and a question or two, but I'm going to withhold for a second and just go to the question and answer box here. There are a couple of questions or a couple of things that have been put in here, and I'll go through them. I think there are 3 now at this point. I think one of them is really quite straightforward, and I think you probably answered it already, Sandy, in your presentation. So an anonymous attendee asked whether the compensation would be for things specifically denied or stolen in the past, such as land, education, training, healthcare, businesses, or something, things of that nature, or would the funds be given to spend on a no strings attached basis? Be correct to say that it's the latter that you're proposing, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely, because that would be consistent with
established
other ways in which,
qualification, you got the compensation. Okay,
it's
great.
consistent with other ways in which compensation has been provided. Other individuals who receive compensatory payments have not been told that they have to spend it for some specific purpose.
Or for that matter, that they have to go beyond the qualification that's specified in establishing eligibility to find that this particular person suffered this particular type of harm. Okay. Go down
although,
to,
if I could respond to that question, although I on a personal level agree with Sandy, if you think about the way the government looks at these issues, the government in the largest compensation program, which is veterans disability compensation, which is hundreds of billions of dollars every year for veterans compensation. I mean, there is a big problem which I've spent years and years of my life, working on, which is that the norm for most veterans disability benefits is that veterans have to demonstrate that they qualify. They have to go through a significant administrative burden to demonstrate that they were in fact in the place at the time where the bomb went off, even if they've come back without 2 legs. So the concept of trying to make something presumptive for the veteran, whether that's that that you were there where there were burn pits, or you were there in Vietnam where Agent Orange was being dispersed, and therefore we can sort of say, yes, it obviously makes sense that if you were in Vietnam serving at a time when Agent Orange was there and you have this exact medical condition that Agent Orange causes.
I want to push back a little bit at the array of cases that you are claiming are analogous. The analogy that you brushed aside was the case of compensation for Japanese Americans who had been subjected to mass incarceration during World War II. But that is the case that is most analogous because it is a consequence of a race-based injustice. The other examples that you're talking about are specific harms that occurred to individuals, perhaps in the line of duty, in the context of an occupation, in which they were exposed to some dangerous circumstances, but it was not a consequence of their race or ethnicity. And that's a very, very different set of circumstances, and it requires a different type of structure of compensation.
You
Okay, so my second comment here, and I'm skipping down because it came up earlier, although the timestamp is later. It's from Richard America, and I think it's basically a comment, which says Cornell Brooks asks why, and an answer is found in Paying the Social Debt: What White America Owes to Black America, 1993. And the technical calculations are at least in part shown in The Wealth of Races: The Present Value of the Benefits from Past Injustice, 1990. Anything to respond to there? I'm not entirely sure that there is. But if there is, feel free.
I concur. I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
Let's then go on.
I only want to add that that's the book that Richard edited, which got me on this whole track.
Okay, so Wileen Johnson asks, or Willeen Johnson, excuse me. Thanks for this discussion, Sandy. You and Kirsten discussed the need to fulfill a claim to right the injustice suffered by slaves and their descendants, but there has also been damage done to America as a whole, an imperfect union prevented from forming a true political, economic, and social union. Do we need another program to repair the damage to the whole? If so, what form should it take, and should we design it together with the program to settle the justice claim of the descendants of slaves?
I think the real problem is that the whole process of white supremacy has actually been beneficial to a segment of the population. That the crafting of the racial wealth gap through federal policies has actually been hugely beneficial in a disproportionate way to large numbers of white Americans. So it's not just a question of America being harmed per se. It's specifically Black Americans being harmed to the benefit of another segment of the population. So if we want to be concerned about the types of inequalities or injustices that may exist within the other segment of the population, then indeed that does require a separate set of policies. And in fact, I've been an advocate for a long time of what some of us refer to as an economic bill of rights for the 21st century, which would be a structure to provide economic security for all Americans. But I don't see that as a substitute for, a replacement for, nor at this point something that should take a higher priority than the unpaid debt to Black Americans.
I would add in supplementation to that in 1976, I was privileged to be part of a small team that met in the office of Congressman Augustus F. Hawkins to draft a bill, which eventually emerged in a very attenuted form as the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act that attempted to do that. But so the tradition of attempting to provide what was essentially a fulfillment of the economic Bill of Rights offered by President Roosevelt in 1944 has a long and valiant history. Eddie Gray asks, Dr. Darity, has viewing reparations from a tort framework been considered? There is plenty of evidence of which families and firms participated and benefited from the enslavement of Africans.
So personally, I would love to see the families and firms who benefited from the enslavement of Africans who acknowledge their complicity and their benefits to become part of a coalition that would lobby and petition Congress for a comprehensive national program of reparations. I think it has to be done through congressional legislation. There has been a really tortured history of attempting to make this happen through the court system. And I would add that the courts don't have the capacity to enforce a program of reparations, even if they settled the suit in favor of the plaintiffs. So, so from my perspective, no, the tort framework is not particularly useful if you're talking about the tort framework literally as a process of using a lawsuit mechanism to go through the judicial system.
Cornell Brooks, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just footnote Sandy's point, as someone who served in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, at the time in which Japanese Americans were being compensated for the harm that they endured, I would argue that legal settlements are the best legal settlements attempt to do what it is that we're endeavoring to do here, which is to say, to look at individuals who are harmed, but to systemically respond to a problem. The challenge, though, with litigation is you have to breach a settlement agreement, have someone come forward, have a judge respond to that in order to ensure compliance. So Sandy's point is spot on. So when a settlement at its imaginative best responds comprehensively, thinks proactively, endeavors to create certain affirmative mechanisms. But the challenge always is that you're constrained within a judicial framework. You have to wait for breach of a settlement in order to get any kind of enforcement, which is an argument for a legislative response.
Yeah, and I would just add that the families and organizations that benefited from slavery were benefiting from an immoral system, but they were benefiting from a system that was illegal at the time.
Right.
And so the federal government is ultimately the responsible party because it is the federal government who made those practices legal.
An anonymous attendee asks, or states, there would probably be a larger appetite for African-American reparations if the dollars were for specific purposes similar to insurance, farming, and other programs. Those that continually impose it are convinced that the compensation would be spent frivolously and would not result in closing the wealth gap that is intended to do, along with acknowledging the injustices.
So if this individual is an economist, they suddenly have become heavily paternalistic.
And one point that I think is important here is if you look at the reparations debate historically, I mean, you see this paternalism, but you also see this asymmetric evidentiary burden, which is the notion that we have to prove that these claimants are particularly meritorious, have particularly good judgment in terms of spending, using, investing any compensation due as a consequence of their harms. And so part of our effort in this paper was to de-exceptionalize reparations for Black people. You know, in other words, it's not a one-off. To put it in a larger context of the history of federal compensation for harms. And that includes recognizing the claimants in the same way. They're no worse and no better. But they should certainly be accorded no less.
Yeah, nobody raised this question when payments were made to Japanese Americans, nor should they have.
That's right.
Nobody raised this question when payments were made to the families that lost loved ones during the 9/11 attacks through the trust fund. So it seems, once again, this is kind of the reflexiveness of underlying American racism. And you know, and it's an attitude that can be internalized among many of us who are Black as well. But this belief that there's some kind of dysfunctionality on the part of Black folks that has to be corrected or managed in the context of providing them with compensation for a debt that they have been owed for 156 years.
I would just say that having looked at several hundred programs of compensation now, I could not find a single one in which there was any in which it was dictated how the compensation should be spent.
Can I say something here? Yeah, I think that the virtue of what this sort of, Sandy said you didn't like the sort of wide net for compensation. I think the virtue of the wide net and talking about many different forms of compensation is that it normalizes it. And you can say, there's just exactly what Linda said, that there is no prescription on how any compensation would be spent in any other program. And here, again, why is this different? I think it sets you up to have the conversation that I think you want to have, which is, why not? Why not do this thing? I think it's an excellent way to do it. And then I wanted to ask about ongoing racism. I see this is basically a retrospective moral responsibility, but the harm, as you've noted, is through the 21st century, and it will continue, right? I don't imagine racism will be erased when my daughter has children. 100 years from now, my grandchildren will be facing these issues. I imagine. I hope not. But this is in other words, what I'm saying is a long and ongoing.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the question of people's educational exposure. And one of the important themes in our book is a discussion of the phenomenon of what we refer to as dismemory, which is the systematic and intentional distortion of the nation's history. And it's an activity that was conducted in large measure by the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Daughters of the American Revolution. And we say in the book that the other facet of a reparations program, besides the compensatory payments, must be an extended program of curriculum and instruction that provides Americans with an accurate story of the nation's evolution. So, very much in concert with what you were talking about.
Let me, if I might, just attempt to just summarize two, I think, critical points that have been made and elaborated on so far. One is that what is being proposed here is feasible, and that there's plenty of precedent for it, plenty of administrative capacity, and that even very recently it's been done on a very large scale. So that, I think, has been established as a point of fact. And I think that we've also heard very strong arguments that as a question of whether this issue fits in the general rubrics for which compensation is paid as a matter of distributive justice or retributive justice, that it does. That this is very much in the nature of not only a vast harm, but also an ongoing one, which it's not simply something that ended with the Emancipation Proclamation and the post-Civil War constitutional amendments, but obviously continued and continues. So those 2 points seem to me to be established. And I wonder if I could just, I have one technical question that I think I'll address to Sandy Darity. And then a question about, which I think has not been developed quite so much, about in some sense, the macroeconomics of what's under discussion. The technical question is this: as I understand the racial wealth gap, this is a question of a certain sum of money per household, and I believe the average is about $300,000. Is that
per individual?
Right? Per individual.
Yes, it would be $840,000 per household, but it comes closer to, actually it's closer to $350,000 per individual, because the average Black household is larger than the average white household.
Okay, so that I think is an important point to get out here, and that then justifies that the focus of this as essentially distribution to individuals who make claims rather than a per household claim. Is that?
That's right.
that's-
And it would be, an equal allocation for each individual who was eligible.
Okay, so then the question then comes up is how one does this in a way which essentially does not produce a windfall for the existing holders of physical assets who are mostly not African American, in the sense that you're going to say a large sum, you place a large sum of money into people's hands, but the price of things that they're going to buy, I'm not talking about the price of current goods. I don't think that's much affected, but the price of physical assets, and particularly land and housing and so forth, and for that matter, prestige and goods, college tuitions and so forth, might well go up, but particularly things like housing, in which case the transfer comes to the benefit of people who already hold those assets. And I'm,
this is what we have referred to in some of our work as the Chappelle effect. There's a sketch that Dave Chappelle did where Black Americans receive reparations, and because of the way in which it's spent and the absence of Black-owned businesses, of a big infrastructure of Black-owned businesses, the money actually goes back to white Americans. I have three kinds of reactions to that.
Mhm.
The first is, of course, if the expenditures result in people acquiring goods and services that improve their lives, then so be it. The second response is, as I suggested, that we could give people the resources in less liquid asset form. And so we would actually be building their wealth position truly, as opposed to essentially giving them an income transfer. And under those circumstances, the speed and the way in which the funds get dispersed or spent would not have the same kinds of consequences. And then the third thing is, well, suppose that the redistribution that takes place would actually provide Black Americans with a sufficient foundation of wealth so that you could really have a flourishing Black business community. And in that sense, the funds could ultimately be spent on Black businesses. But it's certainly possible that you could design a program in such a way that you gave folks, Black folks, the money, and it all got spent on products that were produced by whites. And so then the serious question is whether or not there was a consumption benefit for Black Americans from that. And one could presume that there might be.
Then following up on that, and you mentioned earlier that one way to do this would be through annuity payments, which would then spread things out over time. The macroeconomic impact would be limited, but the wealth effect would still be there. And I just wonder whether you've considered whether the Social Security system might not be the simplest and most effective way to implement such a program.
I hadn't thought about that.
So here's a back of the envelope calculation.
Go ahead.
All right, if you said that anybody presently the age of 30, that is to say, who can qualify on the basis of 12 years, as you said, as an adult of having identified as a qualified person, would then have, and anybody up above that age, would from, let's say, the age of 62, earliest age for qualifying Social Security, get $2,000 extra a month. That's $360,000 up to the age of 77, just for example, per person.
Well,
Too late.
Yeah, I mean, if you spread it out over that period of time, the real value would not be $360,000 in.
Oh, I understand. Yeah, I understand, but okay, you can adjust the number.
You need to make the adjustment in the numbers.
I was thinking $300,000 per person, 360 over that period gives you at current interest rates a rough net present value.
But I agree with Neta that this is the premise that we advance in the book is that the allocation of funds should take place in no longer a period of time than a decade, because it is urgent for individuals to be able to have access to these resources to have a true transformative effect on their lives. So, it's not going to make much difference to me because I'm already 68, but it sure will make a heck of a lot of difference for a lot of other people who are not even close to that age.
Right,
can I ask
but then I'll come back to Neta just a second. But the grant would be immediate, and so from that standpoint, everybody make financial calculations that would have an immediate effect because they would know that they had a future income stream that was guaranteed, that would be coming in later. That's sort of the idea. And of course, for those of us who are older. Yeah.
Have you just made an argument that's contingent on rational expectations?
No, I just made an argument that's contingent on the existence of a certain amount of credit markets and advanced thinking.
But this
I mean, it's
doesn't-
not
this
rational
doesn't work for
expectations about
people.
your guess of what would happen. I'm into sure things. Let Neta Crawford go ahead.
Yeah, but just let me react. It doesn't work for people who don't have the assets to do what you're saying. If you can't eat, the expectation that you might be able to eat better in 10 years is really just not helpful.
Yeah.
That's a dramatic thing, but I couldn't eat in college. I ate cream of wheat in college every day.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, me looking forward to even age 30 was just like, that's not helpful in a day-to-day way. But I just wanted to ask about this other thing, which is really clear to me, which is the health gap between African Americans and everybody else. And in particular, the shorter life expectancy and the higher rates of dying of certain things, like for Black women, breast cancer, and infant mortality, and maternal mortality for African Americans. What do you think? I know this is not what you're talking about, but how would you address that? I've got three really creative economists here. How would you do this? It's a consequence of racism and economic disparity as well. So I just want to see where you're.
No, it's extraordinarily complicated, and we've just done a project for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on the relationship between wealth and health disparities, more specifically. And so there is strong evidence that if you could improve people's wealth condition in many disease categories, you should have a reduction in the differential between Blacks and whites in terms of the health outcomes. Now, it's not the case for all disease categories. The maternal infant mortality is particularly perverse because the most highly educated Black women with professional degrees or master's degrees or higher, have the highest infant mortality rates among all women. And so that would suggest to me that that's not necessarily a question of resource differentials. It must have to do with differential treatment by the medical system. And actually, the more highly educated Black women actually getting a lower quality of prenatal care. So I won't claim that closing the wealth gap would affect all dimensions of the health disparities, but there are categories which would improve. And I would include here hypertension and diabetes in particular.
I'm not one of the three economists, but I do wonder if by increasing the number of Black people of relative means of, would you not better open the gates to healthcare professions? So in other words, when we look at the infinitesimally small number of Black doctors, particularly in the specialties. So in terms of advocacy within the disciplines, right? So in other words, having more Black OBGYN physicians who can advocate on the inside, who can expose disparities on the inside. I would assume that that would have some positive effect. I mean, from my vantage point of teaching advocacy, doing advocacy, in the NAACP, we would sometimes try to expose disparities by going to the very top. In other words, getting the leaders in the profession to raise an issue that's relatively well known to a higher plane of advocacy. So having people with more means who are able to ascend faster or get in the door must have some positive effect, particularly with infant mortality, I should say, infant mortality and Black women's mortality, simply because when you look at the degree to which income doesn't have an effect, or I should say it has a perverse effect, as Sandy's lifted up.
I would add one more thing. There's a research project that was led by Eugene Richardson at Harvard that I was a contributor to, where we demonstrate through a simulation exercise that COVID-19 infection rates would have been lowered anywhere from 37 to 65% if Black Americans had received reparations in a sufficient amount to eliminate the wealth gap. And this is because if you improve the economic status of Black Americans, you would have permitted them to live in communities where there were less crowded housing conditions, and they could have exited from some of the low-paid jobs that had a very high risk of exposure to the disease. And so if you think about COVID-19, that's an example in which you could argue that closing the wealth gap would have had a significant effect on the transmission rate. And if you reduce the transmission rates within the Black community, we also demonstrate that it would have reduced the transmission rates across the entire population.
Cornell, I thought you were an economist. I'm sorry. So there were four.
No. I'm a civil rights lawyer.
Okay.
But Sandy, aren't you? Doesn't that relate to like the mobility studies in terms of segregation, the degree to which people are able to move into higher income neighborhoods, their children have better educational outcomes, economic mobility for the parents, which has all kinds of spillover effects elsewhere?
Yeah, so there's two elements that confine people to particular neighborhoods if they're Black. One is obviously residential segregation and discrimination. The other is their lack of resources to be able to move into other neighborhoods. But I guess my hope is that if you had an alteration in the wealth position of the Black community on this order, it would make it possible for people's conditions to improve in the neighborhoods where they're currently living.
So let me just ask another question, whether you've done a great deal of international comparative work, Sandy, and I wonder if you have any, examples of of something on a similar scale operating elsewhere in the world. Are we doing with this? Are you proposing something that's historically unique, or it's obviously not unique from an administrative standpoint, but in terms of the scale? Other things that come to mind?
I think what might be distinctive or unique about it is only the number of people who would be beneficiaries of this of this debt payment. I mean, obviously, an obvious parallel is the payments that were made to the victims of the Nazi Holocaust. But their numbers are not the same as all.
They're much smaller.
Yeah.
Malaysia?
I'm sorry?
Malaysia, that comes to mind as a country which has obviously a great deal of let's say of a group-based history of this kind.
Yeah, and the new economic policy has a dimension of wealth redistribution mechanism, or it had it. That some people might say look like some active reparations, but again, the scale is much smaller just because it's such a comparatively small country.
But, you know, here again, I mean, I would argue that this is a reason to broaden the lens a little bit. When we think in terms of what we have just done, what we just mobilized, and what we've just spent on COVID
Yep.
payments. I mean, I remember, you know, when this thing first started and, you know, sitting next door to me with Jason Furman, and Jason saying, we should just pay money to every single person. You know, we should just send them money. And I mean, like this seemed like a crazy idea. And like, boom, you know,
That's
we did it.
basically what was done.
Right. I mean, that was just done.
Yeah.
And, you know, with somehow with the force of urgency, in which all of the usual stuff about how we're going to administer is going to be a problem. What are they going to spend it on? They're going to spend it on, you know, alcohol, you know, all that stuff fell by the wayside, and we just did it. And by stepping back from only looking at some narrow cases, because here what I like best about Sandy's proposal and using the wealth gap as a proxy is that proxy enables us to think about the fact that there is this compounding effect in this case with the health issues and the housing issues and the education issues and the you know, criminal justice issues and all these different things which have evolved and compounded and whatever. But you know, all this stuff. It's not just one thing. And one of the things that, however, what I'm trying to keep in my mind, though, is the fact that when you look at government programs, most programs are structured in a more specific way. You know, going back to Callie House, she was looking for reparations for the taxes on certain crops that you know were collected, and most government programs would say we can identify everyone who was denied a mortgage based on, you know, insurance policies, redlining, you know, that's a lot of people. If you can show that, we can set up a program for that. I mean, so we're kind of trying to keep in two minds the fact that you have this giant set of harms for which the wealth gap is a good proxy, with the fact that the way the government typically addresses harms is based on identifying the harm, identifying the people who were harmed, and paying cash for it.
And also, I mean, just lifting up the illustrative case of veterans, the whole matter of recognizing veterans and their descendants, right? So part of the response to reparations is, it happened a long time ago. In our paper, we make clear, as you do, the relationships of these harms over time, the compounding effect over time, the degree to which they extend well into the present, but also the descendants, right? And to the extent that this legislation recognizes this principle of addressing those who are directly harmed and their descendants, with the understanding that the harms impact the descendants over time. So, you know, part of our endeavor here was to establish a floor, right? So in other words, these reparatory compensatory programs are a floor of comparison that make the moral case for reparations for Black Americans stronger, right? So in other words, relative to Japanese Americans, direct parallel, right? But relative to these generic, you know, everyday, not particularly exceptional federal programs, it makes a case for reparations for Black Americans all the more.
We have just a few minutes left, so I'd just like to ask the panelists if they had any final observations that they wanted to offer.
No,
Sandy?
I'm
Go ahead.
sorry. No, I just wanted to thank everybody. I mean, this has really been an extremely thoughtful conversation. And it's great to have a conversation where the issues that are explored are really how best to make this happen, as opposed to whether or not it should happen. And so I really appreciate that. You know, the more I think about it, the more I am really appreciative of the presentation that you gave, Linda, in terms of normalizing the notion of compensatory payments as being something that's quite commonplace in U.S. government practice.
Cornell or Linda?
I thought Neta was on the just about to make a point. I would simply echo the appreciation that's been expressed. Your thoughts and contributions, I think, will help the paper all the more. And I would just simply end with the fact that the oldest living veteran of World War II, oldest living veteran, Lawrence Brooks, just passed away within a week. And he never received housing benefits, never received educational benefits. Received at least 4 medals for his service to the country. His life is a metaphor, I think, and a moral premise for what we're talking about here. And I think that the sheer breadth, complexity of the programs that we've lifted up demonstrate that it can be done. That we have the administrative capacity, the moral imagination. We certainly have the normative precedent for all the things that Sandy has described so well in his book. And I think it's a strong refutation of many of the arguments that have been made. And I would note here, it helps us make the case. As we note with Japanese Americans, telling the stories was important. Having hearings were important from the vantage point of public education in service of public advocacy, in service of reparatory justice. So with that said, thank you.
Linda?
So I also thank you, and thank you to the people who have attended this seminar. I think that one of the things that's interesting just in this session alone is how the combination of civil rights lawyers, public finance economists, political scientists talking together about these issues is very, very creative. And I hope that we can do it more. I hope we can put our heads together more. I mean, this is, it's the issue of our times, and I hope that we can work on it together more.
Neta, Crawford, anything?
Nothing to add, but thank you
Okay.
so much for the privilege of
Thank you.
being
And
part
for
of this
me,
conversation.
yeah, for me, I have to say it's a great privilege to have been asked to chair this conversation. It's been a real pleasure to be able to listen to it. I have to read a very touching note that was put on in the Q&A by Richard America, who notes that the first time this topic was on the NEA and AEA program was in New Orleans, and I think that it's correct to say it was 71. And that a certain Professor Galbraith, John Kay, was president of the AEA that year. And Richard writes, he stopped by our session for a few minutes as he made his way around the conference, and he signaled that he understood what we were examining and thought the work had merit. So this year it is fitting that his son is doing this session. And Sandy says it's a lovely coincidence, but Sandy, it's not a coincidence at all. It's entirely a case of acorn falling close to tree. That's all there is to it. So from my point of view, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to the audience who provided us with a lot of interesting questions and helped keep the conversation going. Thank you to EPS, which continues to do absolutely wonderful work in making sure some of the most interesting things in economics are available at these sessions. And thanks to the panel, especially. And I have to say, just to close on a light note, that we really did well by anthropology, sociology, and culture this afternoon. And so I'm just say, once again, I think this has been a really remarkable discussion. And great credit to the.
I also wanted to say that our
Congratulations.
paper will be out next week.
Great.
So finally, with apologies for the delay. So,
All right. I think we're just about coming up to the point where the ASSA will
yeah,
cut us
they
off.
cut us off. Yeah.
Without having our words interrupted mid-sentence, we probably should just say we are adjourned and thank you all.
Thank you.
And
you.
Taya, hello and thank you.